already? We've come tonight to learn about the Walla Walla and Columbia River Railroad, built by Doc Baker from about 71 to 75 of the 19th century. And it's a fascinating story. Over the years, all sorts of things have grown up around it. It was a rawhide railroad, coyotes came down and chewed up the rails, all sorts of strange things. And I'm going to show you how it was actually done. And then towards the end of the program, I'm going to take you for a ride. We're going to go out and I'll show you step by step where the railroad goes. It's still there today. It's no longer a narrow gauge, it's standard, but it still goes from Walla Walla to Wallula, following almost the same roadbed that it did in 1875. So, and then after that, if you're still here and awake, I might tell you a ghost story about the train too, seeing as how it's very close to Halloween. Okay. By 1865, as the Walla Walla Valley, the Civil War was over, gold had been discovered in Idaho, and immigrants were moving into the area. But getting crops and products to market and receiving supplies from far away was limited to steamboats and mules. If the area was to grow, it would need a railroad. And I'm curious how many of you have ever seen this movie. And that's the truth. You can't get far without a railroad. And when Doc Baker envisioned the railroad that he wanted from Walla Walla to Wallula, it was the first point-to-point railroad in Washington Territory. The only other railroads in the Northwest at that time were portage railroads. They take you around One Falls from the landing of a steamboat to the next landing, and so you didn't have to portage up and over those the hard way, you just took the train around it. But to get from point to point to do business, to conduct commerce, you had to have a point-to-point railroad. And Doc envisioned it. He went back east, he visited Pennsylvania. That was where railroads were built, and people knew how to run them. And he got all the information he needed, and he started the dream that we could do this. We could do it ourselves here in Walla Walla. Walla Walla was not a large town by today's standards, but it was one of the largest in Washington Territory. We had 5,000 people in the 1870 census already, and we were a service community. Most people that were passing through here were buying horses, going to the gold fields, raising wheat, doing those kind of things. And most of the people that lived here were blacksmiths and hustlers and all sorts of people that were needed here in the Northwest. Before the railroad was built, though, all of those supplies that were needed at Fort Walla Walla and for the community were brought in by steamboats. And from there, they were hauled to Walla Walla on mule trains. Imagine, if you've ever driven from here to Walla Walla, that's 32, to Wallula, that's 32 miles. And doing that in horses, and doing it in wagons, and doing it with mules. And getting there and getting back, it's usually a 2-day trip, and they charge $13 a ton, whether it was you, or whether it was wheat, or logs, or whatever they were hauling. It was $13 a ton. Doc thought that was outrageous. It cut into everybody's profit, and he was sure that if he could build a railroad, he could reduce that overhead and get some profit going for the local people. Then as now, there were folks with that vision, and Doc led them. In the 1868, he went to people here in town and he said, we need money. We're going to build this railroad, and it's going to take some money. And people said, well, just how much do you think it's going to take? And so Doc went out and he hired the Surveyor General for Washington Territory. And that man went out and he surveyed the whole route. He figured out what it would cost to put in wells for the water, to lower the grades, to make it a simple track. Well, the problem was you still needed that money. And the surveyor, he estimated that this was going to take somewhere around $600,000 in 1875 money. And Doc said, I don't know. There's no way that I can raise that in a community this size. He said, I don't think I can do it for that. But perhaps if I found ways to do it, because one thing I'm not going to do is borrow money. Now, this is interesting from a man who founded Baker Boyer Bank. But there's a quote, "I'm opposed to borrowing. I once saw my father broken by just that sort of debt. I formed a maxim then, shun debt as you shun the devil." So he knew what the pitfalls of that borrowing could be. If he didn't finish this railroad, he was penniless and had no railroad either. So he was real skeptical about it. When he asked people in town, "I want to build a railroad, will you get up a bond issue, will you help me out?" What do you think they said? Nah. That's almost impossible for somebody to do a thing like that. And I don't think you can do it. And so they skipped out. They said, "No, we're not going to do it." Doc said, "Well, okay, I'm going to start on my own." His idea was that he could start from Wallula, work his way east towards Walla Walla, and maybe he only gets 10 miles. Well, that's still 10 miles you don't have to haul those mules. So they can bring it by mule to there and go, and as he earns money, he can keep adding on to his railroad. $675,000. And Doc said, "I can do it for a lot less." And the way you do it is you cut corners. Now, how many of you have ever ridden on the Sumter Valley Railroad? Yeah, that's a narrow gauge. That means that the rails are only 3 feet apart. Standard gauge is 4 feet, 8.5 inches. A much bigger, much heavier rail. Doc figured by using the 3-foot narrow gauge, he could save some money. And on top of that, not using iron rails, but using wood. Wood that he could harvest from here in Washington. We are the evergreen state with lots of trees. Haul it down the river, saw it at Wallula, and move it by train in to see the railroad. So that's exactly what he did. The first cost-saving measure, I'm going to make it a narrow gauge railroad. Second cost, I love this one. When I portray a conductor, I just imagine having to do this. Now, most railroads would build a well, and they would build a tower, and they would pump water up into it, and as the train came underneath it, you would fill your tanks. The first 2 engines were actually tank engines, which meant that the water went around the boiler, not in a separate tender. All you haul behind your engine was a flat car that had the wood on it you needed to burn. The water itself was surrounded around that boiler. And how do you get the water? Well, you're going to cross the Walla Walla, the Touchie, and Mill Creek. And when you do, you stop on a bridge, you have a rope and a bucket, throw it down into the river, get your water, and start filling up your tanks. And it would take 2 men, and it would take them an hour or so to do a complete fill up on the tanks, and away you went. But you didn't have to drill a well or dig a well. You didn't have to build a tower and a small building to maintain it, and you didn't have to send people out when things didn't work. It was an interesting way to save money. He didn't need depots, but he did build one along the way at Touchie, and then a small one at Wallula, and another small one here in town. He saved money every way he could. He went back to Pennsylvania. There were several narrow gauge railroads running in the western part of Pennsylvania, and he went to Porter and Bell, who made engines, who built them. And he started looking at what would be the most practical ones to use, and he bought 2. The 2 that he bought, he named the Walla Walla and the Wallula. They were small engines. You can see how fat and rounded that thing is. That's the tank I was talking about. It goes over top of that, the boiler. The nice thing about that is that water's already warmed up before you feed it into the boiler. So you're not putting cold water in there. You're putting already preheated water into it. The 04 OTs, you probably will see that a lot if you become a railroad aficionado. In the steam era, a steam engine was described according to its wheel arrangement. And an 04 OT means that there are no front wheels, there are 4 big wheels in the middle, and no rear wheels. And the T means it's a tank engine. The one that we have out here, and we'll talk about later, is an 06Os. No front wheels, no back wheels, 6 driving ones, no T because it's not a tank engine. It actually had a tender that hauled the wood and the water in it. You could also cut costs by reducing the number of people on your standard crew. Back east, the railroads were running with 5 people. There was a conductor in charge of the train. There's an engineer, a hogger, who actually does the controls and runs the train up and down the track. There's a front end brakeman, a rear end brakeman, and a fireman. The fireman is the guy that has to throw the wood in and shovel coal or whatever it is you're doing with the railroad. Doc said, you guys can do double duty. He said the engineer, well, all he does is sit there anyway, so he can throw the wood in. So we don't need a fireman. And the conductor, you can jump out and do the brakes, we don't need brakemen. And so we had a 3-man crew instead of 5. Sometimes 4, depending on what we were doing. Told you about that. Wallula was located, that's one of the reasons he chose Wallula as his destination. It was already a port for many of the steamboats that went up and down the river. So consequently, you had everything you needed coming in at Wallula. The engines you bought, they came into Wallula. The rails, the ties, the hardware, everything you needed came into Wallula. And from there, you could just ship it as you built your railroad going east. Land was acquired near the steamship docks, and I have a picture in here a little bit later taken from Google Earth that you can actually see part of where the old right-of-way went, and it's down to where the water came up after the dam was put in, and the old yard is down underwater. But you can see the approach in that system in that slide. I'll show you. In 1871, the rail hasn't been laid yet. Lumber was floated down the Yakima River to Wallula to make rails, ties, and loading docks. The scraps from building that are what they used to throw into the boiler of the engine and keep it going. So Doc was being very frugal. Nothing went to waste. And he put his son in charge of the sawmill. There's a fellow that didn't need wages, but he worked for Doc, and he was related to him. And in 1871, as the logs came down the river, they'd snag them, drag them over to the shore, and they would begin processing them into rails, into firewood, and the things that they needed. Wallula started to grow. By 1872, the town of Wallula was growing in part due to the railroad. It had a hotel. Anybody been to Wallula? This is going to sound like a hotel, ice house, warehouse, butcher shop, saloons, stores, a doctor's office, a livery, and corrals. And very shortly, it would have a railroad yard too. Wallula was a growing concern at the time. Now, supplies like iron spikes, scrap iron, wheels, car frames were hauled up the river from Portland and unloaded at the Wallula railhead. In order to get the engines from Pittsburgh all the way out here, the way they did it was they hauled them by rail and took them down to the docks in Philadelphia, loaded them onto ships, took them down to Panama. Panama already had a railroad, 26 miles across the isthmus. No canal yet, but they had a railroad. They'd unload, put them on that railroad, take them over to the Pacific side, load them back on a ship, haul them up to the Columbia River, and then by steamboat up, portage, up, portage, up, portage, and eventually end up at Wallula. A lot of work, but it got here. The Walla Walla and Columbia River Railroad began laying track eastward from Wallula in May of 1872. After they arrived, the 2 Porterville engines carried crews, did roadbed preparation, and hauled wooden rails, scrap iron, and ties. Now you can imagine, why are you building from Wallula to Walla Walla? Well, that's where everything is. So you build a few miles of track, you go ahead a little bit further, build a few more, go ahead a little bit further, and a few more, and just start working your way towards Walla Walla. The rails, however, and the cars and the other things were pretty rudimentary. If you were to look at the cars that were being used on the railroad at that time, what you would see are cars that are basically like this. It's a flat car with iron stakes on the side, pockets for stakes that you could put up. You put those up, you could put boards around it, haul wheat, you could stack logs on it, you could do a number of things with a car like this. You could haul in parts, you could haul in cannons and weapons and things for the fort. So these cars were rudimentary, and they didn't have the couplers that we have now. If you've been down and you've seen the railroads now, they have what are called knuckles. They look like this, and they slam together, and they hold, then there's a pin you pull to release them. They weren't doing that. The way this was done was a very dangerous way to do it. They had links and pins, and the way that worked was you have a pocket on either end of the car, and then you have a pin that you hold up like the fellow's doing here on the right side. He's got that ready to drop in. And here comes the dangerous part. You have to stand between the cars to do this. And then you have to signal to the engineer to bring it back. Now, you don't have a whole lot of room there, even if that does collide with each other. So you have to be very slow. The engineer has to be very good at what he does. And when he gets back there into that link, he drops the pin through it and the cars are connected. When it comes time to disconnect, just the opposite. He has a little bit of slack, you pull the pin out, the car is disconnected. That's why a lot of engineers and people who work in a railroad come to look like that. The brakes were rudimentary too. Air brakes weren't invented yet. If you wanted to stop one of these cars or keep it from rolling around, or even stop the train if you had to, you had a person that would stand on the car and he would turn that thing with a wheel and it would make that brake shoe go against the wheel itself. And what happens when you grind steel on steel? Sparks go every which way. And if you've looked along our railroad even today, we have a lot of dry grass and sagebrush and all sorts of interesting plants out there. And those sparks would start fires and we had all sorts of problems. So there were 3 fronts going on at once. Up in Yakima, on the Yakima River at Teanaway. You don't know where Teanaway is? That's up like Cleella. That's St. They were cutting lumber all the way up there, floating it down the Yakima to the Columbia to Wallula. That's going on. The Columbia River, they were collecting all of the stuff coming in from the ships, and they were collecting the wood and sawing it and getting it ready. And the third location was on Cameo Heights and out from Wallula into those sagebrush flats. All of that was happening at once. In 1872, the track lane was tough and crude. Ties were flattened on one side, ballast was local dirt, and wooden rails needed to have the iron strap nailed down. In other words, what you were doing, you would take and build a rail. It was usually 4 by 6 in a square front like that, set on top of the ties, gauged out so it was 3 feet, and then on the inside of that, a piece of strap iron about 2 inches wide was nailed to the top of that rail. And then the wheels from the engines actually rode in that little strip of strap iron. And that's going to cause a problem. I'll tell you about that in a minute too. Then you would spend a day just building this right away and getting the rail down, and it was slow, hard work, all done by hand. And the next morning when you got up and went out there and continued your work, you couldn't find your railroad. It was all covered over with sand. The wind, anybody been to Wallula when the wind blows? I'll make it easy. Anybody been there when it doesn't blow? No. So the wind and the sand would cover up the railroad. You had the guys go out with shovels and brooms, clear out that way, and start building again. So every morning, if you could build a half a mile of railroad in a day, you weren't getting anywhere near that, because you spent the first half of the day uncovering the rest of the railroad and starting over again. Not only that, Doc had some problems. Remember, the word I use is frugal, and he was very frugal. He hired a cook, and he fed his crews, but the food was not the top quality that they expected. And where you normally would work and maybe have eggs and bacon and hash browns and all sorts of great things for breakfast, you might get a bowl of oatmeal. Same thing a horse might get. And so these guys got kind of upset, and they took a couple of their leaders and they said, "You got to tell Doc, we're not going to build this railroad if he doesn't feed us right." And Doc said, "You're already being fed. I don't charge you anything for what I feed you." He says, "Feel free to bring your own food if you want." And so there was a lot of animosity at first. And so Doc solved it by firing the 3 people that were causing the problems. And that ended that, and they went back to work again. Imagine a railroad built out of wood and running on only a piece of scrap iron. Now you have a 14-ton engine, not to mention all the cars, going down the track on that wood. It gets wet or gets old or something happens to it. It starts to flake and crumble, so you're constantly repairing and replacing some of that. Doc starts looking for some iron rail. He wants to make sure that he can keep his railroad prosperous without going broke, trying to maintain it. And he starts having problems with those strap irons. Those things would do what is called a snakehead. Now there's a strap iron, that's kind of what it looks like, and it's nailed down with these spikes, but the problem is, when you run that train over a few times, those things get loose, they vibrate out, and the next thing you know, swing! And that was you sitting in a car, or it was your wheat products in the bottom of a flat car, and wing! All of a sudden out through the floor comes one of these snakeheads. And you'd have to back off, you'd have to pull the thing back down, and you would tie it into place with some rawhide. Now, it wasn't the best way to do it, but it worked. Now you can continue on your trip to Walla Walla, back to Walla Walla, and send the crew out later on to replace the bad rail and the strap iron that was there. And these snake iron, as far as we know, nobody was really hurt by them, but there were a lot of people that got scared to ride the railroad after that. Work continued eastwards. Doc Baker's efforts to gain financial support failed. He asked again for money to help. People thought, nah, and not only that, he's building it anyway. So why do we need to donate any money? Doc got to what was called Cummins Crossing. If you were to depart from Highway 12 and come out along the Walla Walla River, you would get out there a ways and the railroad would be up to your left, right, depending on which way you go, and you would see milepost number 8. And that's about as far as he got with the wooden rails. And he had a trailhead there that he could, the wheel skidders could bring their stuff out to that point, load it on the train to take it in. The advantage to that was it was easier to load from the train into the boats and the steamboats than it was to do it from the wagons. It was less labor intensive. You could actually use the booms on the dock and load them up easier. So for a while, Doc stopped there, and he thought, okay, I'll ask for more money, and he did, and he didn't get it. But he kept building anyway, and now he got an opportunity to buy some used rail. There was a place in Wales where the railroad went defunct, and he found out about it, made him an offer on the iron. They shipped it over from Wales the same way, loading it across the isthmus and so on. Got it up here, and he originally started putting it on curves in places where there was a lot of stress on the rails, because that's where most of the snakeheads were occurring. And so what he ended up with was enough rail to start building the rest of the railroad with rail. And from there on out, he was no longer that rawhide railroad that everybody called it. He was now the steel railroad. So they found other names for the railroad. I'll tell you about that later. 1873, right in the middle of building this, along comes a financial failure back in the East. People were actually speculating on railroads, investing way too much money. The railroads couldn't cover what they were actually loaned, and the market crashed, and that kind of speculation hurt the people that were producing engines, producing rail, producing all the things you need to run a railroad, and there was a crash. But Doc continued on. He had already got his rail, he already had a crew in place, and he continued building his. He wasn't set back much by that. By June of 1874, 16 miles of track had been completed to Two Sheet. Y'all know where Two Sheet is, right? Now the highway goes around it, but if you follow the old frontage road, you can see where it is. At the end of 1874, the terminal at Two Sheet had shipped 4,000 tons of wheat and received 1,100 tons of merchandise. In other words, what's happening is those mule skidders are coming to Two Sheet, and from there you're going by rail. You've cut your costs in half as far as these guys are concerned, and you've got a real bargain on this side. So Doc was really pleased. I mean, think about how much he was charging. About $5.50 a ton as opposed to $13 a ton. And he was shipping 4,000 tons of wheat. He was going to pay for this railroad in short order. The interesting thing too is, when you look at a modern railroad, there's all kinds of switches and side pockets for doing maintenance and service. There's roundhouses or engine houses or oil storage and all those kind of things. Doc didn't have any of that. In fact, the few switches that were outside the yards at Wallula and at Two Sheet were just these small switches like this. One man should go out, throw that lever, throw the switches. Now they're run from Omaha on a computerized network. Folks from Walla Walla can haul their goods to Tushy using the mules and wagons, load them onto the WW&CR for faster delivery. And the amount of things and the diversity of things that were being shipped by railroad is amazing. I mean, we know agricultural products, of course, but there was whiskey. There were all sorts of things that came to Fort Walla Walla. And the folks in Walla Walla wanted the railroad to go all the way to their town, even though they wouldn't kick in any money or support it. They thought Doc's building the railroad and was going to bring it into town. I mean, he lives here, why wouldn't he? Besides, Doc's going to build this thing in. He gets to Frenchtown in the autumn of 1874, just a little bit east of Tushy, and he looks around and he says, you know, Whitman, I can get to Whitman, and then it's only 10 miles to Walla Walla. But at Whitman, I have an opportunity. The opportunity is, instead of going to Walla Walla, I could head down to Milton Blue Mountain Station, Center City, which would become Weston, and so on, all the way down. And he went to Walla Walla and he said to the people there, he said, guess what? You have to make a decision. I need $75,000, and in 1 year, I'll be in your town. Or, I'm going that way. Now, people in town had to think about that, and they gave it some thought. And they thought, boy, those towns are growing down there. I think Doc's going to make a decision that we're not going to like. And sure enough, Doc asked for 75. The people in town said, we'll give you 25. And Doc said, okay, I'll take 25, and I will be in your town in 1 year. And remember, this was the autumn of 1874. And good to his word, the cost of the railroad was only half of what the Surveyor General predicted. And to celebrate the arrival of the Walla Walla Railroad in Walla Walla on October 23rd, 149 years yesterday, here in town, he offered to take anybody that wanted to ride on the train to Walla Walla. And on October 23rd, 1875, that's exactly what he did. People showed up at the station. The station at the time was down, y'all know where the yard is here in town? The old Union Pacific Yard. You go over on Highway 12 at the 2nd Street exit there. That was the home of the yard from the beginning. It's changed. The depot was on the other side of the street. A few things have changed. But this picture is from 1886, and it sketches out where the yard was. And he said, come on down. We're going to load up all those flat cars. Remember those? And he put stakes on the sides, put some boards on, stacked in bags of wheat. And if you wanted to go, you sat on a bag of wheat. There was one passenger car. That's it. It was an old box car with a couple of windows, and they affectionately named it the hearse. You can imagine riding in that and sitting on bags on the floor, and up comes one of those snakeheads. Might not be a good selling point for the railroad, but Doc said, we're all going to go. And everybody went. There were kids, there were people, they packed picnic lunches, everybody went. It was a 2.5-hour ride on this train to get there. And interestingly enough, this was still farm and ranching country out through that part of the Walla Walla County. And you had cows, they just wouldn't listen to the railroad. And they'd walk over the tracks and they'd stand there and they'd munch and they'd crunch and they'd look at you when you came down. We'd give them a blast on the whistle and they didn't care. This was their country and we were intruders. And it was terrible. So Doc came up with an idea. Instead of a cow catcher on the front of our engines, we put a wooden platform. And Doc got some collie dogs, and the collie dog rode up there. And as we went down the tracks, the dog knew what that meant, and he chased the cows off the track. We didn't even have to slow down. And when he was done chasing the cows, back up on the platform. And off we went and continued. Kids loved it when we made that trip to Walla. The trip took about 2.5 hours for a distance of 32 miles. And that's a blistering 12 to 13 miles an hour. You could go faster on a horse, but not for 32 miles. you would have to slow down at some point. So we just continuously went 12 miles an hour, and 2.5 hours later we arrived in Wallula. There was a picnic, the steamboats blew their whistles, Doc gave a speech, Henry Villiard gave a speech, some others that were there were talking about the future of railroading and commerce and how Walla Walla would grow. And after that was all over and done, we came back to Walla Walla. Now, the interesting thing about that is it was a day late today. It was a gorgeous October day. A little bit on the cool side, plenty of sun. Those trees were changing colors, the cottonwoods, the willows, the aspens, the things that we saw along the way were all changing colors. And it was a beautiful ride. When we got back to town, Doc started telling people what it was going to cost. If you were going to ship your wheat, it was $5.50 a ton. If you were going to ride on the train, it was $5.50 a ton. So if you alone rode on there, you paid $5.50. And the reason for that is, Doc said, my railroad is not a common carrier. In other words, I'm not a passenger railroad. I'm a freight railroad. And the only way I can take you is if you're freight, and you travel at your own risk. And so people, especially ones that were well-to-do, paid the $5.50. These are actual Walla Walla Columbia River passes. We have 3 of them that we were able to locate, and mainly because of who owned them. So I thought I would show you this. This is P.B. Johnson, Esquire, editor of the Walla Walla Statesman's newspaper. He had a pass on the railroad. This is Levi Amkin, one of our first senators from Washington Territory. He had a pass on the railroad. And this is Philip Ritz. Anybody been to Ritzville? This is the guy who founded Ritzville. And he also had a pass on the railroad. And then on the back of the pass, when you read it carefully, the Walla Walla and Columbia River Railroad Company shall not be regarded as a common carrier, nor as liable to him for any injury to his person, or any loss or damage to his baggage, which may occur while using this ticket. In other words, you were freight, and you took your chances and rode the railroad. Well, that lasted for a while, but as Doc got more and more money, he put it into investing in upgrades to his railroad. Eventually, he got some passenger cars, and once that happened, he changed the way he charged. Originally, it was $5.50 a ton for you. Eventually, he said 10 cents a mile. Now, if you got off at Walla Walla and got off at Wallula, $3.20. But along the way, if you wanted to go from just, say, Divide to Reese, 9 miles, you paid 90 cents. And we would pick you up at Divide, and we'd drop you off. You all know where these places are, right? Okay, I'll tell you. I'll tell you where they were. But you could ride it for 10 cents a mile, and this is a great idea. Now, the railroad became a popular area to go to and ride. After only 1 year of operation, in 1876, the shippers in Walla Walla were upset with the prices charged by the WW&CR. And the reason is, they were saying, didn't we invest this $25,000? Shouldn't we get special rates for our freight? And Doc said, I'm charging you 236% less than the people with the wagons and mules. And they said, yeah, but we didn't donate any money to them. We donated it to you. Why don't you give us a break? He said, every cent I am getting from this railroad right now is going back into improving the railroad. And one day we will be not only the only railroad, but the best railroad. Rates were already low enough. He said, I can't really lower them anymore. He said, I won't make any money at all. And so for another year to come, everything was reinvested back in the railroad. Folks in Walla Walla thought they should get a smaller freight charge, but people tried to get him to reduce his prices by suggesting several schemes. This is politics at its worst. One of the schemes, I love this one, there was talk of building a canal from Whitman to Wallula. A canal. Can you say Walla Walla River? They were going to make a canal out of the Walla Walla River and take it all the way from Whitman, Michigan, that area, all the way down to Wallula. If you think that it was expensive to build a railroad, will you try and build a canal? 90% of the farmers and shippers agreed to stop using the railroad and pay higher rates to ship by teamsters. They thought that boycott of the railroad would affect the railroad and put it out of business, but they were wrong. Doc had friends, and one of his friends was John Ainsworth. We have a little town that was named after him down by Pasco at Sacagawea State Park. Mr. Ainsworth ran the navigation companies. Steamboats came and went with his blessing. And he said to Doc, who was his very best friend, he said, you know what? What if we gave special rates and special service to the railroad customers over the mules? He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. If the wheat comes in by rail, I'm going to take it priority. It's the first thing to get loaded and the first thing to be shipped out. The other stuff will sit in the warehouse until I get around to it. And that's exactly what he did. He posted it, and what do you think happened? Suddenly, they were using the railroad again. In 1876, they carried 16,766 tons of wheat. That's just wheat. At $5.50 a ton, that's $92,000. The next year, they carried 28,806 tons of wheat. At $5.50 a ton, that was 158 in just 2 years of operation. Doc had recovered about 75% of the cost of building a railroad from wheat shipments alone. And we don't even have some of the facts of the other things he shipped. What about the military? And what they were taking and receiving on that railroad? And how about the other people, the blacksmiths and the livery stables and all those people that hauled in wheat and things they needed for food for the horses? There were a lot of money being made. And Doc was putting it back into fixing up his railroad. Then he said, you know what? I had that idea of building from Whitman down there to Blue Mountain Station and beyond. He said, I'm going to do it. He said, we'll just make it part of our railroad. And that's what he did. With the fort adding more money and revenue to his railroad, with the town adding more and more and growing slowly, he started advertising. He said, some of the freight and passenger rates are going to be lowered. I want you to use my railroad. You want to use it, and I'm going to make it profitable now because I can still make money at lower rates, and I can give the benefits to you people. And that's what he did. He said, and I'm going to service more people than we do now. We're going to head down the other way. Well, in the years that he was operating, before he decided to go down towards Milton Free Water, he ended up having one small accident. And they were crossing the trestle bridge over the Walla Walla River in August of 1877. And the engine got to one side, the caboose was still on the other side, and several cars went over that embankment. Well, they cleaned it all up, they got it back in operation. Nobody was hurt, some wheat was lost, the cars were damaged and rebuilt. A good blacksmith could take care of that and nothing flat. And there were no injuries. And then Doc said, I got to give up the railroad for a little while. We had an epidemic here in town, and the diphtheria struck. If any of you are familiar with diphtheria, you know it can be passed from person to person, and it's usually due to unsanitary conditions, which in 1875 were pretty much the standard of the times. And Doc took care of his patients. He went from being the railroad man that he wanted to be to the doctor he was. And after treating people all over town, he was back in their good graces. Everybody forgot about the strike and building a canal to Wallula. All of that was forgotten. And he said, I'm going to expand my railroad. I'm going to head down to Milton Free Water in that area, but I'm going to add some more engines. The third engine, number 3, was this one, the Columbia. The Walla Walla and Columbia River Railroad. This is an interesting engine. It's a 240. It has more horsepower than the other 2 engines combined. It could haul longer freights. It could go faster. It was a much better engine. He called it the Columbia. And then he bought the one that's sitting out here now. He called it the Blue Mountain. It's an 060. It was built during 1877. Completed on January 1st of 1878 and shipped out here that same year. And interestingly enough, this yellow part that you see here is actually a photostat of the original delivery order for that engine. And if you look at it closely, you can see, it tells you how big the drivers are, tells you all these details on it. And even at the bottom here, he says the name on the cab will be Blue Mountain, and below it in the tender will be the WW&CR railroad. So when we start recreating these things, we know exactly how it's going. He went on to buy the Mountain Queen, which was a 240, very similar to number 3, the Columbia. And the JW Lab was the very last one he bought in 1878. It was a 260. The advantage to the 260 over the 060 was those 2 front wheels helped guide you along the tracks. Now, you didn't always need it. Our railroad from here to Wallula is fairly flat, not too many steep curves, but a little bit of grade here and there. And those front wheels help keep you on the track. That's the one that's sitting out here now. I'll let you take a good look at that before I put stuff on the top of it. It weighed 14 tons, and along with the tender, she totaled about 17 tons. She had 5,000 pounds of traction and between 150 and 200 horsepower. And she was given the number 4, which she had off and on for the rest of her life. It would have an interesting career, too. This engine was bought for the Walla Walla Museum. It was brought in here, it was served here, and then the narrow gauge slowly started going out. The standard gauge started coming in, and it got moved around to wherever they were still using narrow gauge. The Walla Walla and Columbia River was first. The Oregon Steam Navigation Company was second. The Oregon Railway and Navigation was third. The Mill Creek Flume and Manufacturing Railroad was next. The Oregon-Washington Railroad and Navigation was next. Union Pacific had it for a while. The Nome Arctic Railroad and the Seward Peninsula Railroad had it last. Now, Doc was impressed by those engines. He bought all 6 of them from the same company. He knew they were reliable, they needed very little maintenance, and he bought every one he could from them. And when he sold it, he sold all of those engines, but to different people. 1879, 3 years after he landed, or 4 almost, after he landed here in Walla Walla, he started that narrow gauge spur down to Milton, Blue Mountain Station. Everybody knows Blue Mountain Station. Centerville, we call it Athena, and then you go west and then on down. 4 years after reaching Walla Walla, Doc built a branch towards Pendleton from Whitman Station. This is gone now. It burned down a few years ago. But until it burned down, it actually had a loading dock that went all the way back to the Walla Walla Columbia River Railroad area. You could go down there and see a loading dock from a railroad that was 140 years old. And when you get to the bottom of the grade coming out of Milton Freewater, you start back up again. It's a really tight turn, and it's a 3% grade. Even the modern railroad people will tell you how much trouble they have going up that grade. That yellow pin that you see in there is where that station was, an elevator that we looked at a slide ago. And then if you follow it down, there's a big curve at the bottom. If you were to go under that curve today, there's a tunnel there. It says 1917. During World War I, we upgraded our railroads, and a lot of the old wooden trestles were taken out, and fills were put in, tunnels were made for them. Even today, the grade is a challenge for modern diesel engines. If you start up that, I had an opportunity to take a ride on a scooter, a little speeder that checks the tracks, and it's a grind even for that little thing to get up a 3% grade on the tracks. If there's ice on those tracks, you go for a sled ride. Whee! And then hopefully you make the turn at the bottom. The line was completed through Athena, which at that time was called Centerville, to Pendleton in 1887 by the Blue Mountain. This is an original blueprint of the track that went through that Blue Mountain station, and I took the picture before it burned down, and that yellow line is pointing to that old warehouse dock that was there from all the way back in Wallula's time. With several railroads converging on Wallula now, it's the ORN's coming in, the WW&CR is coming in, Northern Pacific is moving towards there. It becomes a railroad town. That's a picture of old number 4 out here, the Blue Mountain, taken about the time it was getting ready to be sold and moved out. You can see kind of what it looked like. After 1881, Doc Baker had several narrow gauge engines and lots of surplus track, but he had begun to sell the WW&CR. He sold it to Ainsworth, who then turned it over to the OR&N. Don't try and remember all of this. He turned it over to the OR&N, and he kept he sold 7/8 of it and kept 1/8 for himself, just to say he was still in the railroad business. And he decided to build another road. This time it would go from Walla Walla out towards Tracy, on Mill Creek, and also a spur up towards Dixie. And when he started building that, it was narrow gauge. He had the rail. The other part of his railroad was now converted to standard gauge, but he still had narrow gauge equipment and rails, so he started building that railroad out there. Anybody been to those places? You know what Tracy is? You can see almost where the railroad split out there. You drive out, the road splits. Tracy goes one way, Dixie goes towards the other direction. Old number 4, it came and went. It was sold to UP and OR&N and OWR&N. It was used for a portage railroad for a while. And finally, 1894, it came back to Walla Walla. And it was used to haul on that old Dixie line from just south of Dixie all the way back into town. And it hauled 2 things in primary. Let me go back here a minute. Yes, sir. No, okay, the reason you saw the penitentiary there is, that's where the penitentiary was built, with clay and bricks being hauled on this railroad. The Mill Creek Flume and Manufacturing Company, let's see here. There we go. The Mill Creek Flume and Manufacturing Railway was in the brick and lumber business. Those are the 2 commodities they hauled. Doc Baker's old narrow gauge engine, the Blue Mountain, was the workhorse of the railroad for many years. From the terminal in Walla Walla, the line headed east, split towards Dixie and Tracy. At Tracy, the railroad hauled out trees that had been flumed down the hillsides. As far as they know, there's no remnants of the flumes left. Anybody ever seen any of that? I never have. I have an idea where it used to be, but can't be sure. Anyway, they would haul them down, load them onto the train, haul it over to Walla Walla, load it onto the standard gauge, and haul it off. The other branch went out to Abooooard. Now, Abooooard, if you're going on Highway 12, coming out of Walla Walla and going north towards Wadesburg, you're going to go down a little dip. There's Sapaleo Road on one side, Spring Creek on the other, and that little dip used to have a railroad bridge across it. And that's gone now. But that's Abooooard. And Abooooard had some interesting geology. When you look at the soils that are in there, there's clay along Dry Creek. It's not a great clay when you look at it, it's not so much. But once it's processed, wetted down and baked and processed, it makes wonderful bricks. How wonderful? I'll tell you in a minute. The way it was done is you have this wagon that's run by mules or horses, and it scoops up the clay, and then it goes up over this little bridge that's built especially for that over the railroad. You put one of these little dinky cars in there, as they call them, and then this little wagon on top here, man pulls a lever, the clay drops down into the car, and then it's hauled off to be made into bricks. Interesting. The clay then, it's mixed with water and processed in the molds, dried, and made into green bricks by prisoners. We had plenty of labor in those days. The green bricks were fired by a kiln by the prisoners until they cured. The finished products were called burn bricks. How many did they make? A report from 1897 to 98 listed 2,656,000 bricks having been manufactured at the penitentiary, with 600,000 still in hand. Now they had enough bricks to not only build a penitentiary, but to sell them to local people too. And when you go downtown and you see some of these old brick buildings, chances are pretty good that that's where the bricks came from. In the fall of 1897, 406 cars of clay were hauled from Abooooard near Dixie. That's just the fall of 1 year. Today, one of the engines that hauled the clay to make those bricks is being cosmetically restored, and it's on display right outside our door here. You may even have time to see it tonight. Well, the Mill Creek Railroad finally went under. The Northern Pacific bought the right-of-ways towards the Dixie line. Northern Pacific moved in, and they decided they were going to convert all of this narrow gauge track that was left into standard gauge, and they did. So by 1905, that was done. And here we have these engines that are narrow gauge, sitting here doing nothing. And Alaska came along and said, we can use that. And so they hauled it up to Alaska, up to Nome. And that railroad became one that went up to Anvil Mountain out of Nome, about 30 miles, just about like what it was doing here. And when you got all the way up into Anvil Mountain, it was like gold country. At that time, the largest gold nugget, 12.5 pounds, was found up there, and the Blue hauled it out. And they found more. It wasn't until 1998 when they found a nugget 294 ounces that they found one that was bigger than what old Blue out here all the way. The Seward Peninsula Railroad in Alaska lasted from 1906 until it became part of Alaska Railroad. But Blue Mountain was out of work in 1910. And that was it. They took it out and set it beside an engine house, and it began to rust and deteriorate. And one day they were building a seawall to keep the ocean out, and on the dry side of it, fortunately, they threw everything they could find into scrap, rocks, everything, including old Blue. And what you're looking at in that picture is what's sitting out here now, only it's been restored. Who would have thought that that would ever get up and run again? Well, there was a man, again, with vision, sort of like Doc, and his name was Herb Engstrom. And he decided he was going to fix that engine up, and he was going to make a tourist railroad out of it. And he started to do that, but he passed away. His daughter, June Engstrom, well, she had this engine sitting in her yard for a long time. And she said, Dad's never going to fulfill that dream. I'll put a notice in the paper, and somebody will buy it. And sure enough, a man in Richmond, a doctor, he saw it, and he said, I think that's the original engine from here in Walla. And so some members of the Washington State Railroad Historical Society went up to Nome, looked it over, looked at the serial number still on it, by the way, number 238, and you can say, oh, can you believe it? This is the one that used to be in Walla. So they got some people to partner up, and they made plans to move it back to Walla Walla. The Crowley Marine Company and Neil Lamson, those people with the big blue cranes, they loaded it onto a ship, and Crowley Marine hauled it down here. They unloaded it in Pasco. It sat in Pasco for a number of years. And then in the year 2000, on the 125th anniversary, October of 2000, 125 years later, it sat in front of the Baker Boyer Bank. And everybody came to see it and said, oh, that looks strange. It doesn't look much like an engine. And so people weren't real enthused about it. And it was taken back and set behind the Washington State Railway Historical Society's building museum in Pasco. And there it sat, and sat, and sat. And it would probably be there today, except in June of 2017, they said, you know, we could take that out to Fort Walla. Well, that's really where it belongs. And there it is. They brought it out. We had a crew here, many of the Rotary members, who came in and started doing the work on restoring this engine. Now, it may never look like this again, but this is an artist's conception of what it used to look like when it was making its runs in and out of there. Hoover says he can hand paint some of that, so maybe one day you'll see it that way. A couple of myths and facts about building the railroad. I love these, so I'm going to share these with you real quick. They used to say that the way Doc got his engines here to Walla Walla was that he bought plug hats in Portland. He gave them to the local natives, and he said, we're going to disassemble this engine. I'm going to put a part in a hat. You carry it around the falls and get it all the way over to Wallula, and then you keep that. Didn't happen. Surfing with a whiskey bottle. Walla Walla was 5,000 people strong in 1870. Buildings were all over this town, and they had been built with survey equipment. Doc had survey equipment, but people said no, Doc was cheap, and the way he made sure that the roadbed was level, he took a bottle of whiskey, drank half of it, and used the other half to make that just right. As far as we know, Doc wasn't a big drinker. I love this one too. When Doc started his railroad, he had no idea what gauge he was going to buy. Would it be a standard gauge, narrow gauge, some special gauge? He didn't know. So what he did was, he laid one rail from Wallula to Walla Walla. Just one. And then when the engines came in, he put down the other rail. I don't even need to tell you that's not true. I just told you started at Wallula and you took your engines and followed the track. He knew what he was buying before he laid rail. He had ordered it. And he knew that it would be a narrow gauge railroad. Coyotes ate the rails. This was a great story. I still hear this. People tell me, yeah, in the wintertime the tires would come out, and it was all a rail made out of rawhide. And those damn coyotes, they'd come down and they'd chew up the railroad. No, but we did use railroad to make temporary repairs. But by then, the coyotes weren't going to eat steel on the top of the rails. And I always liked that story. Doc bought 2 used engines in Philadelphia. No, he didn't. He bought 6 brand new engines in Pittsburgh. Write that down and be a quiz. Railroads have changed over the past century and a half. Some have disappeared. A few regional roads still exist, and even more branch lines, like our local ones, struggle to survive. Others have merged from coast to coast. I'll go through this real quick. There are so many railroads that have been involved with this piece of track out here. The WW&CR, for a while in 1992, we had the Blue Mountain Railroad. You may have remembered the small blue engines that were going around. And then they became the Palouse River, and they went to orange engines. Then the Palouse River became Watco, Watco became Wamex, Wamex became Rail-X, Rail-X became Frontier, Watco. And we've had a rainbow of colors of engines here over the years. Not only did the railroads get bigger, but the engines got bigger. The very first ones, those Porter mobiles, they weren't very big. And now look what we have. 6-axle units, 4,400 horsepower, and do you think they can run on our railroad? They did. Burlington Northern Santa Fe, a number of years back, ran all the way from Wallula to Walla Walla to haul out some special cars. They had to go slow. It's a 10-mile-an-hour speed order all the way, but they were able to bring those big engines all the way in. That's a testimony to the grade that Doc had built all those years ago. Some vestiges, you can still find this railroad. If you know where to drive and where to look, it's fun to go out and see what's there and to think about how it was. This is from the old Matadorian Park, and if you know where to sit and watch, you can watch the train go over the bridge, over the Walla Walla River, and then follow this road out all the way to Walla Walla. The beauty of this too, if you ever look on a map of where this roadbed goes, there's only 3 rivers that it crosses. The Walla Walla over by Wallula, the Toushie when it goes through Toushie, and Mill Creek by Whitman Mission. He was able to lay out that road so that there were a minimum of bridges that needed to be built. There are a lot of towns that nobody's ever heard of. There's not much of anything there. I'm going to point them out as we go along and show you where they are. So come with me. We'll start at Wallula in the current Union Pacific Yard. The old railroad yard was right there on the left where you can see it under the Columbia River. And that blank area right there that makes a curve and goes down, that was the old entranceway to the yard that's underwater now. And if you go out to that part where, I'm not sure what they call it now, it was mandatory. If you go out there and instead of making a right to go where the restrooms used to be, you go left, you'll go up and around and you can actually see that old roadbed from the Walla Walla Columbia River. There is a for now track, and it's interesting, when our railroad men come from Walla Walla to Wallula, they get to this spot right about where the highway bridge is, and they call it the for now track. And what they're waiting for is clearance from Union Pacific to go into the Union Pacific Yard. And they have to sit there for now. Not a fun time. Let's take just like they built the railroad, we're going to start heading east from Wallula to Walla Walla. This is what it looks like 3 miles east of Wallula. And And it must be exactly what it looked like 150 years ago. Not much in there. 5 miles east of Wallula. This is at the bottom of 9 Mile Hill. As you're going up, you go over that railroad bridge that goes up and over. This is a town that used to be there was called Reese. And that's looking under that railroad, or that highway bridge. South of 9 Mile Hill, if you were going up over the old 9 Mile Hill, and then you drop down the other side, if you were to go straight to the river, that was the old town divide down in that area. 2 miles east of 9 Mile Hill, 3 miles east of 9 Mile Hill, much like it looked in the old days. 4 miles west of Touchy at the divide crossing. There is a road over top of the railroad there, probably you've been over it. If you go fishing or paddling or canoeing on the river, you've probably been over it. 2 miles west of Touchy. 1 mile west of Touchy. The Touchy River Bridge. Touchy West. Main Touchy. And Touchy East. They'd be proud to know that they have that many places. 1 mile east of Loudon. We took a speeder trip a number of years ago, and we just followed the old railroad to see where it went. Whitman Siding, east side. Whitman Siding, west side. You can get an idea of why they do 10 miles an hour in these trucks. Way beyond there. Mill Creek Crossing north of Whitman Mission. If you go to Whitman Mission and you walk, as you're going in the front of the building, turn left, go up to the end of the parking lot, go over into the grass area, and you can see this bridge right there. Looking east towards College Place from Whitman Mission. The old town of Finch was about 2 miles west of College Place. 1 mile west of College Place. College Place. Anybody ever had to wait for a train there? Yeah. Yeah? You don't like it waiting for trains? I do. That's just me. This is an interesting one too. This is Artesia, and at one time there were artesian wells in this area. This picture in the middle here, the black and white one, is actually one of the artesian wells that was in that area. They've been capped off and used, and you won't find them operating like artesian wells. But for a while, that part of Walla Walla was called Artesia. Now you're at Rose and Myra. You all know that intersection. If you look, you'll sometimes have to wait for a train there. Another place you probably know that, right? Rose Street in Walla Walla. If you follow Rose Street going east, you'll follow up along the tracks. Feral Gas is still there. Every once in a while you see the black tank car spotted there to unload the natural gas. Here they are actually doing it. Now you're just about entering the yard in Walla Walla. That bridge that you see is the Highway 12 bridge that you go over on top of the yard. And there's the yard, pretty junky looking place. Some old passenger cars are there, resting for now. Forever, probably. The Walla Walla yard. The speeder trip. We took the trip mainly to go over the old track and see what was there and what needs to be done and how it looked. Riding in one of these little things, you get a real perspective of what it was like riding in an 040 back in the day. After 150 years, railroading continues in the Walla Walla Valley. We still have railroads Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. If you're in town, you'll probably hear a whistle sometime around noon. You know the songs for crossing, right? For crossing a grade, and they do that down on 9th. They do it in a number of other places here in town. So there's still railroading going on. Doc Baker had a vision and determination and resources to make it happen. Walla Walla in part became the town it is because of his persistence. And the Blue Mountain played its part in building the community too. Bricks for the penitentiary, lumber for homes, grain to feed the world, immigrants and citizens to populate the town, and making people feel a little less isolated. All were done by the little quarter bell edge. Now I know it's late. Anybody want to hear a ghost story? A couple of people want to hear a ghost story. Okay, I'm going to tell you a ghost story. This, by the way, is the depot down in our village. If you haven't been down there, we have a depot, I believe, came from Prescott or in that vicinities, and we're kind of in the process of restoring that. The Walla Walla Columbia River Railroad, from its beginning to its mergers to what it is today, has seen almost 150 years of history go down its tracks. Passengers no longer catch or ride the train from Walla Walla to Wallula, but the rails still gleam in the nights with a full moon. But it wasn't always that way. Many of the trips to Wallula and back took place at night. The weather was cooler, there wasn't much activity along the tracks at night, and the livestock that often wandered over the rails were rested. And I should mention the dog took a nap too. Passengers could sleep while the train clickety-clacked down the track. Besides, the steamboats were tied up at their moorings at night. None of them wanted to try and navigate the Columbia River in the dark, if it could be avoided. So passengers who ride before dawn got a good seat on the paddle wheels. When the Walla Walla Columbia River was first built, it had wooden rails topped with steel strips. It saved money, but it was also a problem, especially in curves and grades. Doc Baker bought some steel narrow gauge rails from Europe and began installing them in crucial areas, only a short time after he built the railroad. But it wasn't long after the new rails were installed that there was an odd passenger aboard the train. At least she was aboard for the first time from Walla Walla to Wallula. Dressed in white, she rode alone in a passenger car in a corner seat. She kept her head down and didn't say much. And halfway to Wallula is the small town of Tushy, where there's a small depot. Passengers could get on and off there if they wish. In fact, passengers could get on and off wherever they wished and pay only 10 cents a mile from where they got on to where they got off. The engineer, fireman, brakeman, and conductor all kept an eye out for potential customers. The railroad not only wanted to accommodate people, but a profit was always nice too. But on this particular trip, the woman who was aboard told the conductor she didn't feel well. Could he stop the train for a few moments to allow her to be sick? He signaled the engineer with his lantern, and the train came to a stop. He helped the lady off, and while she tended to her business, he inspected the train for loose couplers, hot bearings, etc. When he finished, he looked for the lady, but she was nowhere in sight. The conductor noticed that this was on a stretch of line that had been recently converted with a new rail from Europe. He didn't give it much thought at the time because he was concerned for the woman. He asked some of the male passengers to help him search for her, but they didn't see her. One man said he thought he saw something white, maybe mist, from the Walla Walla River, but it moved away. After calling for the woman, blowing the train whistle, and waiting, she still didn't appear. So the conductor counted the passengers, and they were all there. The same number he started with, but not the lady. It was odd, but the train couldn't wait and they moved on. On the way back from Wallula, the conductor told the engineer to stop at the same place the woman had gotten off on the western trip. Again, the conductor looked, passengers looked, and no one found anything. Perhaps she lived nearby and walked home in the moonlight, they all thought. Regardless of what she did, they couldn't find her. The lady appeared occasionally and was seen by the engine crew or passengers. On one occasion, the conductor spoke to her, and she asked if he could help her find her daughter. She was with her, but now she couldn't find her. Again, the passengers helped look for her daughter, but when they tried to find the woman, she was gone. One night, while at the depot in Walla Walla, Doc Baker paid a visit. The conductor was doing some paperwork, and the good doctor asked how the crew liked the new steel rails he had purchased. The conductor said they were a welcome change from the old wooden rails. Doc said he got them cheap when the original European railroad went bankrupt. Why? The conductor asked. Doc explained the original railroad had had a terrible wreck that killed several passengers, including a woman and child. They couldn't get passengers to ride again, and they went broke. He got the steel rails for very little investment. Apparently, one of the passengers on the wrecked train was a woman traveling with her young daughter. The woman's body was recovered, but the child's was not. In any case, the railroad went bankrupt from the accident. The conductor knew there was more to the story than anyone believed. He had seen, heard, and helped the lady, but he just wasn't able to make anyone listen. It wasn't the end of the people seeing the woman along the tracks. No one lived within miles of where she got off. But sometimes, especially at nights with a full moon, or one that's nearly full, passengers and railroad crews report seeing a pale woman in white walking near the tracks with her head down as though she is searching for something or someone. But whenever they try to talk to her or approach her, she quickly disappears. No one has seen her in a long time, but then no one has ridden the rails in a long time. Perhaps if you drive along the tracks on a night with a full moon, you might see her too. Questions? What was her name? I don't know.
Is engine on 9th Street part of this story at all?
No. The engine on 9th Street is a 282 Mikado from about World War II period, that era, used by the Union Pacific. The Maywood caboose with it was part of the consist that it used to go. It may have used this track at one time, I don't know, but it was used throughout the system of the UP, and mostly here in the Northwest. You all know the engine he's talking about? The McDonald's engine.
Why did the railroad do the 10 miles from Wallula to Walla Walla, the new one? Why did they do that?
Why did they do the 10?
Yeah, do the 10 miles. You said, why did they test the track to see if it was working? You said the modern one. Why did the modern railroad do the test the rack?
Oh. They had some cars or something that they had to move. And our railroad apparently didn't want to do it or couldn't do it or something like that. And so Burlington Northern Santa Fe moved in with their engines, took it really slow. All the railroad people in town were out watching us. You never see a thing like that. And that's why they did it. I don't think it was done especially to test tracks. I think it was done because there was a necessity to move something that they either didn't have clearance to move or didn't feel comfortable moving with the engines they had. There's some kind of story like that. I don't remember what it was.
When was that?
That has to be going on 8 or 10 years ago. And I'll look that up. I need to remember. I remember seeing it. I even took pictures of it. But I'll email it. Yes.
So when the railroad workers went on strike, who took over for those striking railroad workers?
For a while, nobody. That's why Doc was in a hurry to settle this dispute. And it wasn't that he was evil man. He was a frugal man. Dare I say, cheap. But he was a frugal man, and he was trying to keep those costs down. And by feeding these people less than what they felt they should be entitled to, it caused some hard feelings.
So did they ever use Chinese railroad workers?
Doc didn't on this particular stretch, but when the UP put that line in from Hinkle to Spokane, yeah, I think they said 2/3 of that crew was Chinese. But for whatever reason, if there were Chinese people on that crew for Doc, I have no record of it. There may have been. I just don't know. This story is fairly recent. We've started researching and getting this stuff together. In another year, I may have those answers. We're just putting it together as we go, and it's amazing what we find out. I mean, 2.5 million bricks? Are you kidding me? Imagine carrying that by you. Yes?
Was there any other places locomotives after the 6 that would
buy any more engines after that. He sold the ones that he had, but he didn't buy any more. He just kind of faded out of the railroad business after that. Went back to being a doctor. Can you imagine that? Being a doctor, that's not exciting enough on the railroad.
You mentioned Mill Creek Loom. I've got steel rods that were used to assemble
The food? Tell me about it.
like 9/16 rod with like a carry bolt kind of head on them.
Square bolts,
6 or 8 feet long.
square nuts,
Yeah, with nuts on them.
square.
Yeah.
How did you come by it?
They were on a lady's property up Mill Creek, and I do steel work, so I offered to buy them from her. And she had another guy that wanted them too, but she ended up selling them to me.
And you haven't used it for anything?
Pardon?
You haven't used it for anything?
I do art, metal art, so I use them in that.
I think maybe it would be nice to have a set here, just out of the house. Maybe an offer, maybe an offer soon. I think that would be great. You hear what he's got? All right, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
There was a wreck maybe 20-some years back. It got unhooked at the sawmill when LP was here and hurried through town. Was that on the test?
There wasn't a wreck, but there was a tank car that got loose from feral gas. And you probably have seen the video. You can still see it on YouTube. What had happened was they had spotted a tank full of natural gas, or LPG, liquid petroleum gas. They put that thing on the siding up by feral gas on rows. And of course, you tie it down, you set the brakes and do all that. Well, we're not sure if they just didn't do it or they were in a hurry or what happened. But these things have roller bearings. And once they start going, if they have any grade at all, they just keep going. And this thing started headed out. It went through College Place. Ding, ding, ding. The lights came on. People waited, and a single car went by. And now people are calling in, oh my God, what are we going to do? This thing is zooming on by now. As it picks up speed at Finch, it's really headed out of town. And when it got all the way out to Touchy, it was doing 40-some miles an hour. And they finally had a couple of guys that got up aboard it and slowed it down and stopped it. But that thing could have gone all the way to Pasco or Portland. and believe it or not, that isn't as uncommon as it sounds. I remember Pasco had a string of 3 boxcars that crossed A Street. If you've ever come in to Pasco, taking the first exit, you go behind the roundhouse. There at the building, there's a yard. You see all the trains and stuff, and there's one track that crosses there. Can you imagine? No lights, signals, or warning. Just shoo! Did you see that? So, is that the one you did?
No.
There was a wreck.
They called the loud lumber. Remember when people went out and Spanish lumber from that?
I honestly don't
It was the
recollect.
rail that went through the LP yard.
I know there's occasionally ones that will derail and spill. I don't know about
That was,
wrecks.
yeah. Oh.
I have to look that one up. I have a friend that's an engineer on this. He's been with the railroad at least 20 years. So I'll ask him if he knows what's going on. I just don't recognize. Oh, there was the one, I forgot about this. Out at 9 Mile Hill, as you're coming around the tracks and you're approaching 9 Mile Hill, going underneath there, the conductor wasn't paying attention and he ripped up 3 miles of track. His last car on the train had jumped, and the wheels were tearing up the ties, and they had a heck of a time with that one. Okay, are we done? We're done.
Yeah, I want to, before everyone leaves, want to just mention that, like Gary said, they finished building this in 1875, so next year is 2025, that means 150 years. So keep an eye out for lots more railroad lectures and different programming. We're going to be doing a lot about that through October next year. And one thing we're going to try to do is put a shelter, a roof over that train. And if we can raise enough funds, maybe also build a tender for it after it's a little bit. So keep an eye out for that. And all hear from Gary again too, when he's building time next summer.